Welcome to the Exam 2 review session. We're going to go through the logistics first and then go into the nervous system and then go backwards and cover any other content you may have a question on. So Exam 2 layout is exactly the same as Exam 1. So the logistics is for the lecture exam. There will be 50 questions. 40 are multiple choice, and those are the ones that you'll see first. And then 10 will be fill in the blanks. It will cover the skeletal, the joints, the muscle, and nervous. It seems like only 4 chapters. Not really, right? Because muscles is technically 2, and nervous is technically 2.5. So we'll just say 3. So kind of keep that into consideration that when you get to the muscle questions, it's going to be very detailed because there's a lot of units in there or chapters in there. Same goes for the nervous system. Okay, I'm going to admit someone into the review session. Hi, Erin, welcome. All right. So the lecture has 50 questions, 40 multiple choice, 10 fill in the blank. It's going to cover the skeletal, joints, muscles, and nervous. Lots of details on the muscle and lots of details on the nervous because it's worth 2 chapters for the muscle and 3 chapters for the nervous. They are still divided evenly and a little bit heavier emphasis on muscles because it is 2 chapters and a little bit more heavy emphasis on the nervous because of the 2.5 chapters. You will have 50 minutes unless you qualify for extended test taking time, which if you do, make sure you check. If you, right before you go into the exam itself, it'll tell you the information in terms of like how much time you have. So double check that before you take it, okay? What else? So 50 questions, 15 minutes. Any questions on the lecture?
Is it going to be equally broken up like last time then?
Yep. Other questions? Okay. And then for the lab is 30 questions. And it is all identification and type in. It's going to cover the bones, and the muscles, the brain, spinal cord, and eye and ear. Okay. Let's see. So bones, muscles, brain, spinal cord, eye and ear. Yep. Okay. So type in and spelling counts. So make sure that when you're studying for this, practice the spelling as well. You will have 45 minutes to do this, unless you qualify for extended taking time. What else? Make sure you read the questions carefully. And when you're looking on the exam, if the image seems small, don't forget that you can always do Control plus to zoom in. And then, of course, Control minus to zoom out. Okay, so Control plus to zoom in if the image seems really small, and then Control minus to zoom out. What else should you know about the lab? Read questions carefully. Identify, the arrow, whatever the arrowhead is on, that's what I'm asking for. So wherever the arrowhead is actually touching this point right here, that's what it's asking for. Because sometimes the structure is really small or there's two structures right next to each other. Whatever that arrowhead is touching, the tip of that arrowhead, that's what I'm asking for. Okay? Any questions on the lab?
So it will always be touching the tip, not the main thing, so it will be less confusing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. And both of these, as always, requires respondus lockdown. You need to have your webcam on. It's a requirement. Please, make sure the webcam is working appropriately. Make sure it's not blurry. Sometimes students, some students there I have in the past try to be tricky and like they put little lotion on the camera and it's blurry. I can't grade that. I can't grade exams when things like that happen. So make sure it's not blurry. You're fully in the image. And hopefully for this exam, for the last exam, the TAs couldn't view it. So hopefully for this exam, I've, I contact IT and hopefully they'll give them permission to be able to go through and view everyone's environmental scan. Okay, so make sure you do an appropriate environmental scan. Because that's more for your proof that you were you upheld the academic integrity. Okay, so respondus lockdown, webcam, make sure it's clear, not blurry. You can use a scrap paper always, just as long as on the environmental scan you show the front and back that it's blank to start with. What else? Yeah. Any questions on those?
So no notes of any kind, just scratch paper, right?
Yeah, you're never allowed any notes of any kind. As a matter of fact, your cell phone shouldn't even be anywhere near you. Okay, so no notes. And actually, when you go into it, that's why the very first question is, I understand that I cannot use any resources, no notes, no internet, nothing on this exam. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
The layout is the same, right? It's just like one question at a time. We're not
Yes,
gonna,
ma'am.
and you can't go back. Okay.
You can go back, but like I said, because of internet issues, I don't recommend going back, but you definitely can go back.
Yeah.
But I would
Okay.
say make sure that you spend enough time on each one that if something should happen, if you do go back and get disconnected and lose that time on that, then you're not penalized by it. In other words, that you've already answered it. So if you got cut off, it's still okay. Okay. Other questions?
Are the previous exams or tests unlocked?
Previous exams and quizzes are always unlocked. You can always review them on respondus lockdown. The correct answers are no longer available, but you should be able to see the questions and your answers to them. Yes.
Because I never see them on mine. They say that they're hidden.
Nope, you should be able to find them. Has anyone been able to look at their quizzes?
I have, yes. You just have to make sure you're still in the lockdown browser, I believe.
Yes, ma'am. Yep. Okay. All right. So let's get started.
I did have a question real quick.
Yeah, of course.
As far as the scratch paper goes,
Mhm.
does it matter if it's lined or not? Like, or does it need to be completely blank? Like if I just have a lined piece of paper,
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. When I say it has to be blank, it means you can't have any writing on it.
Okay. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. All right. Yeah. If you want to ask a question and you're just not sure, you can always email them to me. It's always best to, know the answer before you go into the exams. All right. So skeletal was pretty straightforward. And I will provide these PowerPoints for you. And this is just kind of like the whiteboard explanation that I drew for my class. And I just included for all of you. Pardon, I'm going to go into Google again and admit a student. Welcome, Morgan. And then joints, a lot of memorization, just do flashcards for these. And then muscle had, a lot of content. It had two main physiology content, and that's the sliding filament theory and metabolism. There are videos on those that I posted on Canvas, so make sure you take a look at that. So the request for today was mostly to focus on the nervous system, so I'll start there. And then if you have any questions, I can go backwards, okay? But I want to make sure I have enough time to talk about the nervous system because it's quite involved, okay? So let's start with the nervous system organization overall. So just kind of like the basics. So the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is going to include things like the brain and the spinal cord, where the peripheral nervous system are all of the nerves. Okay. Now, the nerves are divided into two main types, the sensory nerves and the motor nerves. The sensory nerves are always going to carry information in what direction?
To the cell?
To the central nervous system. Yep. So sensory neurons or sensory nerves take information from the environment and sends it to the central nervous system, where motor neurons take the information from that's been decided upon within the central nervous system and sends it to three parts. So motor neurons can send information to three potential areas. What are they?
Is there a way you can make that a little bit bigger? Thank you.
Yep. I knew you were going to ask that. I read your mind. So the motor nerves carry information from the central nervous system outwards. So where is it going to send the information to? There's three possibilities. It's going to either send it to what, or what?
The cerebral cortex?
It's going to take the information from the central nervous system. In other words, the brain and the spinal cord, the brain includes the cerebral cortex and sends it to where?
Your muscles.
Yeah, okay. So muscles would be one. What's another possibility? Sometimes it has to send a signal all the way down to the tippy toes, which means it has to go through another what? Because it's so far away.
It has to go through another set of cells the same way it did.
Close. It has to go through another set of neurons. Okay, and lastly, it can go to what? Pardon, I'm going to let someone into the review session. Welcome. So what's the third place it can go to?
Is it your visceral system?
Yeah, so your glands. Okay, so it can go to the motor neurons, will send information to either your muscles, your neurons, or your glands. Okay, so that's where the output is. It's going to go to the muscles, nerves, or other glands. Okay, now among the motor neurons, you have two types of motor neurons. At this point, both of these types of neurons right here, both the visceral and the somatic, they play a role. They have like their distinctive names. So the somatic is oftentimes referred to as the voluntary control, where the visceral is oftentimes referred to as the involuntary control. Okay, so your visceral is also known as the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, and that's your visceral. These are things that you have no control over. Okay, so there are some responses that your brain and your spinal cord decides upon, and it sends it out, and you do not have control over that. And that's part of the visceral, or otherwise known as the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so within the autonomic nervous system, or the visceral motor nerves, it has two types of control. There's the sympathetic control and the parasympathetic control. If it's going through the sympathetic control, you have no control over it, and it's going to go to either your nerves, your muscles, or your glands, and it's going to result in a stimulation. Think of it as a stimulation. This S with a sign through it means stimulation. So it's going to elicit your flight or your fight response. Okay. Now, the other option within the visceral motor nervous response is the parasympathetic. This is your calming effect. So this results in the rest or digest response. Let me give you an example of that. Okay. Let's say that you ate a really large meal. And when you eat a really large meal, your motor response through the visceral pathway is going to elicit which signal, the sympathetic signal or the parasympathetic signal. Once you eat a really large meal, you get what?
Parasympathetic.
Exactly. It's a calming effect, right? You get sleepy, so that the blood is not like all the blood rushes to your digestive tract, but a lot of it does. A lot of the control does move to your digestive tract, so it can focus on digesting and absorbing that food. And that's why it stimulates the parasympathetic effect. And that's going to cause your heart rate to slow down, your breathing to slow down, everything in your body just kind of slows down because it's diverting a lot of the blood supply to your digestive tract. Versus if you're walking in a dark alley and all of a sudden you hear this loud noise. What's your automatic response? You had no control over it, but what's your automatic response?
Sympathetic.
Exactly, because what happens? What do you notice about your body when you're walking in a dark alley and all of a sudden a loud noise occurs?
You tense up.
To shock.
You
It's
tense up, exactly. You didn't tell your muscles to tense up, but it did it anyways because it was triggered by the sympathetic nervous system, and that means that you're ready to either, tense up to either fight or run, right? So that's your sympathetic nervous system. Questions? All right. Then your somatic is the voluntary one. That means if it's voluntary, oftentimes it means it's going to your skeletal muscle because your skeletal muscle is voluntary. Okay. All right. So that's the breakdown of the nervous system. Let's see. So quickly to overview the spinal cord, make sure that you know how many nerves you have. As a matter of fact, of those pairs, 12 of them come out of your thoracic, 5 come out. Oh, sorry, it's missing the cervical. Oops, I can't write up there. Okay, so it's missing the cervical. Then your thoracic, then your lumbar nerves, then your sacral nerves, and then your coxal nerves. Okay, but the spinal cord looks like this. It looks kind of like an oval shape with a indentation inwards. And wherever that indentation inwards, I'm talking about this right here. You see where I'm tracing with the red? that's how you know if it's indenting inwards like that, that's always going to be the posterior side. And that makes this side then the anterior. That's the trick that I use to kind of help me figure out what's the back and what's the front. Okay. So it's
Are you
divided.
using pink or is there another color? Because all I see is pink.
Okay, if you see pink, then it's pink. It's either pink or red. It depends on how you see it. Okay. So where it indents downwards, it forms that U shape. That's always going to be the posterior. And then that makes the other side the anterior. It is divided into two main types of matter or tissue. There's the white matter. Okay. And then there's the gray matter. Okay, the gray matter is everything on the inside. Right here. Oh, nope, it's not highlighting it for me. Oh, okay, the highlighter's not working, so I will do this. Let's do that. So it's everything in here. Okay, so all of this is the gray matter right here. It looks like a butterfly or an H shape, whichever way you want to view it or see it. But that's all the gray matter. So that means that anything in this area right here is the posterior gray matter, or else the posterior horns, and everything down here is going to be the anterior horns. Okay, so everything up here, posterior horns, everything down here, anterior horns. Okay, then everything in the white matter are referred to as columns. The picture is a little bit cut off, so I'm going to put columns in here. Okay. All right. Then you have a neuron. A neuron has three basic parts. What are the three basic parts of a neuron?
The soma.
Yep. So the soma is where you'll find the organelles. You'll find the nucleus. So that's the soma right here. Let me go like this. The soma.
Axon?
And then the axon is this next one. Yep. And the third part is the
Dendrites.
dendrites. Exactly. The dendrites. Okay. Now, I have a little room to write. So the dendrites, what's the function of the dendrites?
They stimulate. Are they're like the starting point?
It is the starting point. They don't stimulate, but they do receive stimulus. They do receive stimulus, and that makes sense, right? Because at the dendrites, you will find receptors for the neurotransmitters, the chemicals that stimulate, that do the stimulating, okay? So that's why the dendrites receive the stimulus, because they have receptors for them, okay? So let's do a mock, let's make the signal green, okay? So the chemicals bind to the receptors, the neurotransmitters bind to receptors on the dendrites. That triggers a signal to be sent from the dendrites to the soma. Once it reaches the soma is going to pass it on to the axon. Okay, now there are different parts of the axon, right? So the axon has one part here, one part here, and one part here. So the axon has three parts. What's the A part of the axon called?
The axon hillock.
Excellent, thank you. The axon hillock. The axon hillock is referred to as the trigger zone, or the point of no return. If the signal is strong enough to reach the axon hillock, it will then run all the way through the neuron. If it's not strong enough, then it will not continue. But if it is strong enough, to, once it reaches the axon hillock, then it will be carried to what's part B, which is called at the axon itself. So the function of the axon is to carry the signal. Okay, and it carries it to part C. What's the part C?
Synaptic knob.
Excellent. Synaptic knob. And the synaptic knob, let me zoom in a little bit. It's going to contain these things, which are called
Neurotransmitters?
close. But what are these circular sacs called?
Vesicles.
Beautiful. Synaptic vesicles. And you're absolutely right. The synaptic vesicles contain you said it.
Neurotransmitter.
Oh, the neurotransmitters, yeah.
Beautiful. Neurotransmitters. Now, neurotransmitters, what are they? Are they electrical or are they chemical?
Both.
No, ma'am. They
And chemical.
they transmit the nerve signal, but they are in essence chemical. Okay. So because they are chemical, you'll notice that the signal, let me zoom back out again. Okay. And the reason for that is because a neuron is never in direct contact with anything. There's always a space, this space right here. Let's use a different color actually. There's always going to be a space right here. Oops, it's supposed to be a different color. It didn't turn out. There we go. There's always a space right here. Right, so it never comes into direct contact with its effectors. In other words, it never comes into contact with a muscle. It never comes into contact with another neuron. It never comes into direct contact with a gland. There's always a spacer. And that's why it's got to go from electrical in the green right here. Sends down. Because it doesn't connect to anything, it can't stay as electrical. And that's why it's got to convert from electrical to the neurotransmitter, which is a chemical. And that chemical is released and travels across the synaptic the synaptic cleft or the synaptic space, and then goes to its effector, whether it's a muscle. So here's a muscle. Why do my colors never change? There we go. It's going to go to another muscle. Here's a muscle. And that chemical, when it goes to another muscle, when it goes to its effector, that's when it restarts the electrical signal. Zoom, zoom. Ugh, the color changes like this. Okay? That's why it's got to go from electrical initially along the neuron, converts to chemical, and then the chemical binds to the receptors on its effector, and the effector can be a muscle, another neuron or a gland, and then it triggers the action potential to occur again along there. Because it never connects. If it connected, then you won't need the chemical, right? But it doesn't. And because of that, that's why you have to learn how it goes from a signal along the dendrites to the soma to the axon, finally to the synaptic knob that contains the synaptic vesicles that contain the neurotransmitters, because that's a form of a chemical that can cross the space and then bind to its effector. And then that's what re-triggers the action potential along the effector. Questions? And that's what you apply to the previous chapter on muscles, right? Because you learned about the neuromuscular junction. Well, what is that about? It's about a neuron, it's about the space, and it's about a muscle. It's one of the effectors. All right? Okay. Questions? Then, so we learned about the nervous system organization overall. We learned about the spinal cord. We learned about the neuron. One other concept you have to know is how does a neuron fit into, or how do nerves fit into the spinal cord? Like a sample test question might be, where would you find the soma of a motor neuron in a spinal cord? Where would you find the soma of a motor neuron in a spinal cord? And that has been a test question in the past. Think about it. Talk amongst yourself. What do you think?
Would that be the central, like where the central canal is, guys?
Nope. Central canal is where the cerebral spinal fluid moves through.
Okay.
Good guess, though. Keep going.
Would it be in the anterior horn?
Absolutely. By the way, you'll notice that the anterior horns right here, it's a lot thicker, right, than the posterior horn. Do you notice that? The reason for that is because it contains so many somas of motor neurons. That's where the motor neuron receives the signal, sends it out, and that's why the anterior horns are a lot thicker. Where in the posterior horns, you just find the synaptic knobs of a sensory neuron. And
Can you repeat what? Sorry, can you just repeat that again? It was, where does the repeat the question that you're answering. I'm sorry.
yeah, no problem. Always ask. So the question is, where would you find the soma of a motor neuron in a spinal cord?
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Versus I could also ask, where would you find, or I could ask you, what would you find, what part of a neuron would you find, or what neuron and what part of that neuron would you find in the posterior horn? How would you answer that? First of all, what kind of neuron?
Can you repeat the question?
So the question was, what neuron and what part of that neuron would you find in the posterior horn?
Motor neuron?
No, ma'am. The motor neurons are accounted for in the
Anterior.
Central?
not the central. Yeah, I like that.
We got this, guys. We got it.
You got this. You got this.
A sensory neuron?
It is the sensory neuron. What part of the sensory neuron?
The dendrite?
Not the dendrites,
The soma.
not the soma. The axon?
The axon
What is the
iliac.
axon?
Axon hillock?
Not the axon hillock. Keep going. You're gonna get there.
The myelinated part?
So partially, but that's not the significant part.
The node of Rambier?
Not the node of Rambier.
The synaptic vesicles.
The synaptic what?
Vesicles?
Yes, but before it is the synaptic vesicles, it is what? Part of
knobs?
the knobs. That's it. Let's go through that. Why does that make sense? Okay. So sensory neurons carry information in what direction?
To the central
To
nervous
the
system.
brain.
That's right. So it's going to carry direction in. Oh crap! I can no longer write with my pen.
That sucks.
Yeah, it really does. Okay, I'm going to try to use the mouse very poorly because I don't have the exact thing for it, but it's going to have to do. Okay. I can't even write with my mouse. I don't know what happened. That's all right. All right, so the sensory neuron is going to carry information this way. Do you see my arrow?
Yes.
Okay, so that means that the dendrites and the soma has to be out here, right? And at this locate, when it goes in this direction right here, that means then that this is the end right here of that sensory neuron. And what do you find at the end of a sensory neuron?
Synaptic nerve.
That's right. It should make sense. You shouldn't have to memorize any of this. It should just make sense, right? So sensory neurons are always going to go towards the central nervous system. So if it's going into the spinal cord, and if it's ending at the posterior horns, that means that in the posterior horns, it's going to contain the synaptic knob, where a motor neuron carries the information out, which means its synaptic knob is going to be somewhere out here in the environment to a muscle, another neuron, or a gland. That means that in the spinal cord, where it's going to receive the signal, what part of the motor neuron would you expect to find in the anterior horns? Again, nothing to do with memorization. It just makes sense. What part of a motor neuron would you find here if its intention is to receive the signal?
The soma.
So
That's right. The soma and the dendrites. Right? And that's why you find the synaptic knob of a motor neuron outside of the central nervous system.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Like I would say the dendrites. The dendrites.
Yeah, that's right.
You said the soma or the dendrites. Would I be wrong picking either one?
You will not be wrong because the dendrites and somas are attached to each other.
Okay.
Yep. And you will never find a question that says either the dendrites or the soma, because it doesn't exist. It has to be both. Yep. Okay. All right. So the other thing you'll need to know about the nervous system is the brain. You need to know the regions of the brain. Tell me, what are the 4 major regions of the brain?
Frontal.
No, ma'am.
Oh, let's see.
The cerebrum.
The cerebrum,
The cerebellum.
cerebellum.
The brainstem. And the diencephalon.
Perfect.
I'm
Excellent.
both of them, sorry.
Okay, so those are the 4. Now within the cerebrum, it is divided into lobes. Okay, so the cerebrum is divided into lobes. Which lobe controls sensory information?
The frontal or the occipital?
Nope.
Parietal?
Yes, the parietal. Which lobe functions or controls motor responses?
Frontal?
Yep. Which lobe is responsible for vision?
Occipital.
Occipital lobe, that's right. Which lobe is responsible for hearing?
Temporal.
Temporal?
Yep. So all of those lobes are located in what major region?
The cerebrum.
That's right. The cerebrum. Yes. Okay. Between the cerebrum and the diencephalon, it's not a major region of the brain, but you do find a very significant structure. What structure do you find in between the cerebrum and the diencephalon? It's a C-shaped structure.
Corpus.
Corpus callosum.
Corpus callosum.
Yeah, the corpus callosum is super cool because the nerve control that goes into your brain actually crosses over at the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum essentially connects the two hemispheres. Your right side carries the nerves that run from your right side of the body actually go to what side of your brain?
The left.
That's right. And vice versa. So the corpus callosum is where the two types of nerves cross over with each other. And that's how you know, and that's how you know what your right side is doing compared to what your left side is doing. So that's the corpus callosum. It's really cool. Okay. So below the corpus callosum, you find the diencephalon. Di meaning two, cephalon meaning heads, because there are two parts in your diencephalon. What are the two parts in the diencephalon?
Thalamus and hypothalamus.
Perfect. And you said it in the right order. Thalamus and then the hypothalamus. Okay. So the thalamus is a really interesting portion of the diencephalon region. The thalamus does a lot of things. Like you can spend your whole career, you can spend your whole college 4 years studying just the diencephalon, and some people do. Okay. So within the diencephalon, you have the thalamus, and then you have the hypothalamus. The thalamus is really important because what is its function?
Regulates homeostasis, or are we talking about the hypothalamus? I'm sorry.
Nope, we're not quite there yet. We're at the thalamus. So what is the function of the thalamus?
Does it concentrate on hormones?
Nope.
Does it? Is that responsible for like childbirth?
Nope.
Okay.
It directs
So that
sensory
doesn't do
impulses to the appropriate region in the cerebrum.
That's exactly it. It's a relay station. Think of it this way. Like you're calling long time ago, like some of you may know this, but at one point in time, I used to call what's called an operator. Does anyone know what an operator is?
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, not all of you do. Okay. So I used to use a phone that I had to dial, like the round, and then go to
A rotary dial?
Yes.
Rotary
I
dial.
used to use those phones. That's how old I am. Okay. So I used to use a rotary dial.
I did too.
And then I would call the
Still younger
operator
than me.
and then ask the operator to transfer me to the appropriate office. That's what the thalamus does. The thalamus takes the information from the sensory, from your body, and it sends it to the correct cerebral cortex. And that's why the thalamus is a relay station for sensory information. It's like the operator. Okay? All right. Below the thalamus is the
Hypothalamus.
Hypothalamus.
So the hypothalamus is all the things that you told me was the thalamus, but wasn't. So, so what does that include?
Homeostasis, positive and negative feedback loops, and blood pressure control.
Yeah. So that's part of homeostasis, right? So homeostasis is often controlled by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is really, really interesting because it not only it's the reason why it's so interesting because technically it's a nerve, it's part of your nerve system, but it controls your what system as well?
Endocrine?
Yeah. That's what makes the hypothalamus so interesting because it not only controls your nervous system and specifically your autonomic nervous system, things like hunger, your feeling of satisfaction, hunger, thirst, temperature controls and all that good stuff, but it also controls your hormones. So that's the hypothalamus. Okay. All right. So from the hypothalamus, let's talk about the cerebellum. What does the cerebellum do?
Balance.
Yeah. What kind of balance?
Like if you get drunk, you will fall over because that is impaired.
Yes, that's exactly it. And you actually already used the example I was going to give. Alcohol affects the cerebellum. So alcohol is able to cross the blood-brain barrier and impede the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is responsible for your balance and your motor skeletal coordination, your ability to touch your nose with your right and left hand, walk in a straight line. Okay, that's your cerebellum. And police officers know that when you are under the influence, that this area is impeded. So they do those tests. Okay, so that's the function of the cerebellum. Now we have the brainstem. What is the coolest thing you know about the brainstem? And it is super cool.
It's
The
primitive.
respiratory-
Yeah, it's primitive, and you're right. It controls your respiratory. Get this, okay? Your brainstem makes sure that you are always breathing, even when you're asleep, even when you're eating. You know, some people though, part of their brainstem turns off when they're sleeping, so they just stop breathing. What do we call that?
Sleep apnea.
SIDS.
That's right. And luckily, eventually, hopefully, that part gets kicked on again, and then you start to breathe again. So your brainstem has three main parts. Do you see the number 1, number 2, and number 3?
Yes.
Okay. What's number 1?
Midbrain.
Yep. Number 2?
Pawns.
Exactly. That's easy to remember, right? Because it looks like a pond, B-O-N-D, but it's the pond, P-O-N, okay, ponds. And then the number 3?
Medulla oblongata.
Yeah, medulla oblongata. How many of you have ever watched Adam Sandler in The Waterboy?
Me. That's how I say it when I'm watching it or trying to pronounce it.
Yes, again, we're showing our age, right? So in the movie The Waterboy, if you haven't watched it, it's a classic. You gotta watch it. So Adam Sandler is attending this college class, right? And this professor's like, "Boy, what's wrong with your medulla oblongata?" And that's because Adam Sandler was coming in and he was like, he was huffing and puffing, right? So that's the medulla oblongata. What's the function of the medulla oblongata?
Breathing, heart rate, blood pressure.
That's right. Yeah, it functions in rates and rhythms. Okay, so medulla oblongata is not just the respiratory, but it's also the cardiovascular. Okay, so it controls rates and rhythms of not only breathing but also your heart. Okay, cardiovascular. So let's connect this to what we talked about earlier. You know how we talked about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic? Okay, so if I were to send a parasympathetic motor impulse to the medulla oblongata, what would result? How would it impact my breathing rates and my heart rates?
It would increase.
It'll either speed it up or slow down.
Which one?
Did you say parasympathetic or sympathetic?
Parasympathetic.
It would slow them down.
It slows you down, exactly. So that's what happens when you are kind of like ready to go to bed. You're going to have parasympathetic nervous impulses being sent to your medulla oblongata. That slows down your breathing, slows down your heart rate, getting ready to rest. Okay, that's connecting the two together. Okay, how about your pons? What's your pons?
Face and eye movement, sensations, facial sensations. Hearing
Okay,
and
what else?
balance.
Okay, what else? What is it mainly known for? What center does it contain? Starts with a P.
Posture.
No,
Pituitary?
no. Pituitary is connected to the
Parasympathetic.
hypothalamus. I'm sorry, I cut when you were talking. What were you saying?
Is it the
I said,
parasympathetic nervous system?
sorry.
Nope,
I said posture. Is that
not posture.
not posture?
Looking for the center. The pons is what? The center for what?
I'm sorry, I'm multitasking here. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. The question is, the pons contains what center? Starts with a P. It's a term that you should know. Give you the second letter, N. So far, P and an N. I'll let you buy a
Is this a
vowel.
trick question?
I'll let you buy a vowel. What vowel would you like to buy?
An E.
Yes. Another vowel. So far we got P and E.
Is it the
Pneumatic.
pneumotaxis?
Pneumatic.
Yes, that's exactly it. Did everyone hear?
Can you repeat it?
Pneumatic.
You're close.
Pneumotaxic?
That's it. Pneumotaxic center. Essentially, that's your on and off button of breathing. Remember I talked about sleep apnea? It's the pons, specifically, of your brainstem. So your brainstem contains the pneumotaxic center, which essentially is your on and off button for breathing, where the medulla oblongata does impact your respiration, but it's more of the rate and rhythms. Make sense?
Is
Questions?
is that why some kids die of SIDS?
Oh, I know this, but I can't remember it. Okay. I don't know off the top of my head, and I'd rather not say anything than say the wrong thing. So let me look it up and then get back to you on that one.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure the answer is yes, but I'm not 100% sure. Okay. All right. That leaves number one, the midbrain. What's the function of the midbrain?
Motor control, eye movement, vision, and hearing.
Yeah, essentially it's another relay station. It's the one right before the thalamus. So essentially you can, list a ton of function and it would be true for that. Okay. All right. I don't know where the time went. It's almost 9 and I have to make sure I talk about the action potential, which was specifically requested. So let me take some time to cover that. Okay. So moving on to nerve impulse conduction. There are 4 main stages that you should know. You have what's called the resting membrane potential. My pen works again, thank goodness. The resting membrane potential can also be equated with the word polarized. What does polarized mean? It means it is negatively charged. So if something is polarized, it is negatively charged, okay? So that means that resting membrane potential has what type of charge?
Negative.
That's right. And the reason why it's negative, so here's the neuron. Axon, synaptic knob, so on, okay? So inside of a neuron, you have what ion? Looking for a letter.
Wait, you're looking for a letter, not pulse?
Well, it's an ion, but it's indicated by a letter.
K.
Electron?
Hey,
Potassium.
that's right.
Oh, sorry.
So you find a lot of potassium inside. And at this point, you're like, wait a minute. Didn't you just tell me that polarized means what?
That it's negatively charged.
Right. So now you're telling me that there's potassium, which is positively charged. How does that make sense? What else do you find
There's-
inside of a neuron?
Negatively charged proteins.
That's right. And proteins are large. They do not move. And that's why at resting membrane potential, that neuron, even though it has a lot of potassium inside, it also has the negatively charged proteins that do not move. Okay, so that's why overall, if you were to read it, it reads at what voltage?
Negative.
Neutral.
Negative 70 millivolts. Okay, so it reads at resting membrane potential. In other words, there's no stimulus. No stimulus being sent. This neuron at rest is referred to as polarized because it is negatively charged. Why is it negatively charged? Because of the negatively charged proteins. So overall, if I did a reading on it, it's going to be negative 70. Okay, but let's say I want something to happen. I'm going to send a stimulus. What receives the stimulus again?
Dendrites.
Beautiful. I love that answer. The dendrites. Why are the dendrites able to receive the signal?
Because it's being converted from electrical to chemical.
Because that's part of it, but because it has the receptors on them. Dendrites have the receptors. When the brain sends the signal, the neurotransmitter is going to be received by the dendrites. Okay, so the dendrites receive the signal. Now, when it receives the signal, here's the signal. As it moves towards the soma, this is referred to as local membrane potential. Local membrane potential is when it receives a stimulus. So it's specifically the dendrites, right? So it's the dendrites that receive the stimulus and decides whether to send it along its length. Okay, so where does the local membrane potential occur? Along the dendrites and the soma. Always. Local potential always occurs along the dendrites and the soma. Some characteristics of a local membrane potential, it can be weak or strong. Okay, if it's weak, it will never make it to this part right here, which we call the
Exon.
Node of rainbow?
not node of Ranvier. The other person was saying what?
Axon hillock.
Axon hillock.
Block. That's right. So it's weak. The signal can be weak or strong, but it has to be strong enough to reach the axon hillock. Okay, and what do we mean by strong enough?
If it doesn't meet that threshold, then it won't go beyond that. It'll stop.
Right. So what determines whether the signal is strong enough and meets the threshold?
Whether the proteins move or not.
Nope. So when a local membrane potential occurs, that signal is going to cause a little bit of sodium to enter. When sodium enters in, it's going to change from negative 70 to maybe negative 69, maybe negative 66, maybe negative 59, maybe negative 56. But what point is it strong enough to reach threshold?
Negative 55.
Yes. it's got to go to negative 55 millivolts, which means there is a difference of how much?
15.
Yep. So that signal that's sent has to create enough 15 millivolt difference to make that the overall charge go from negative 70 to negative 55. In other words, it becomes less negative. Okay, so local membrane potentials can be weak or strong. In other words, it's graded. In other words, it can be weak or strong. It could be reversible. It doesn't have to reach the axon hillock, right? It can go back the other way if it's not strong enough, right? So it's graded, it's reversible, it degrades as it reaches closer, it weakens actually. So it has to be strong enough. In other words, it has to have at least 15 millivolt difference to drive the potential from negative 70 to negative 55. Once it reaches a threshold, then nothing can change it. That signal is going to be carried along. And that's what we call an action potential. Now, action potentials is, it's all or nothing. Once if it reaches the threshold, the axon hillock, it's going to go. When it goes, it has to undergo two parts. It's got to become depolarized and then repolarized. Depolarized. If polarized means negative, depolarized means it's becoming what?
Positive.
Yeah.
Or neutral.
No. Positive. Okay. Depolarized will always mean positive. If it's becoming repolarized, if polarized means negative, it's becoming repolarized, it's doing what?
Becoming more negative.
It goes back to being negative. We're repeating, right? Repeating how it's polarized. So it's going back to negative. Now you're like, why? Right? Why does this even happen? It makes no sense. Well, think of it this way. If I had water right here, if I put a ball on top of that water, if the water does not move, does the ball move? Let me ask that again. If the water does not move, does the ball on top of the water move?
No.
Or is it static?
No.
That's right. It's static, right? So the ball, think of the ball as the electrical impulse. So if I want that ball to move along that water, I have to create waves. I have to create waves that move up, waves that move down, up and down. As the wave moves up and down, that pushes the ball from one spot to the next and then to the next until finally it reaches the end. That's like the membrane potential. It's got to go from positive to negative, positive to negative, positive to negative, positive to negative, to push that signal along the axon until it reaches this location, which is the
synaptic knob.
Yeah. And there you have nerve impulse conduction. Pretty easy, right? All right. Now, in order for depolarization to happen, that at this point, action potential only occurs where? So if the local membrane potential occurs along the dendrites in the soma of a neuron, the action potential only occurs along where?
The axon.
Beautiful. You got it. Okay. So how do I make the axon become positive? Because it's still negative 55 after threshold.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yep. So how do I make the axon become positive when after threshold it's still negative 55 millivolts?
Send a stronger signal?
Nope. Sending the signal is done.
Let out the ions. The
Yeah, that's
potential
right.
ions.
The sodium gates open And when the sodium gates open, sodium rushes in. So now the inside still has the potassium, but now it has the sodium on top of it. Even though it has the negative proteins, because of the rush of sodium ions that go inside, eventually it's going to go up to positive about 35 millivolts, to which it just can't fit anymore. At that point, the sodium gates close, and what gates open?
Potassium.
Yes, potassium gates open. And potassium is going to go where it's high to low. So it's currently high inside of the neuron, which means when the potassium gates open, potassium does what? It leaves.
Okay.
And when potassium leaves, that causes the voltage to go down back to negative 70 millivolts. And here's the kicker. Potassium moves at a faster rate than sodium does. So for every two sodium that moves in, 3 potassium leaves out. So not only does it go back down to negative 70, but it goes even lower to negative like 75, negative 80. And that's what we call hyperpolarized. Okay, so that's nerve impulse conduction, right? So here's a diagram of it that shows a little nicer picture. Here you have the sodium gates, here you have the potassium gates. Here's a resting membrane potential. Sodium is on the outside, potassium's on the inside. Then what happens when an action potential happens? Sodium rushes in. Then it reaches a point where it can no longer rush in. Then potassium gates open. When potassium gates open, potassium leaves, causing it to become negative. So you have that flux in the water. Remember, the water has to have waves. So this is waves along the axon that moves the signal from one place of the axon all the way towards the end. All right. So here's another way of viewing it. This is, again, a class whiteboard that I created. So I talk about electrophysiology right here, about resting membrane potential, local potential, action potential, and then there's a graph that follows it. You should definitely make this graph and see if you understand, what each part is. What's A, what's B, what's C.
Sorry, can you zoom in just a little bit? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Say that one more time.
Can you zoom in?
Oh, yeah, of course. So you have resting membrane potential, local membrane potential, action membrane potential, and then be able to understand what that means on this graph right here. What's A, what's B, what's C, what's D, what's E, what's F, and what's A. Okay?